Yeah, there's so many front that it can go wrong. So one of the things I noticed
Mm,
is that Hungary's Orbán, he also, again, on the sideline meetings in the UN Assembly session there, he was working in the rooms and asking China and Brazil to join him in organizing a peace summit. That could
mm,
this peace summit would bring in Moscow and Kiev, so both of them, to the
mm.
negotiation table. I think it's a good idea, but how realistic you think he is? Because I'm sure he himself very sincere, and China and Brazil is, I'm sure, are happy to join him to do this. But there is this forces from the United States, from Britain and other European unions. They are working actively against these things. So how realistic you think his plan can be?
Right, I have to make one actual point here, which is that this idea of an international peace conference to resolve the Ukrainian crisis, which is an equal one in which both sides are fairly represented and can state their views, actually, that goes back to Wang Yi. It was actually
Okay.
Wang Yi who suggested it first. I can remember, in fact, not Wang Yi, in fact, it was Xi Jinping. It goes
Uh-huh.
back to the ideas that the Chinese were floating last year. Now, the
Mhm.
Brazilians have enthusiastically adopted it. They were talking a few weeks ago about an immediate ceasefire and negotiations and a peace conference. And Wang Yi said to the Brazilians, slow down. We can't quite have a ceasefire yet. This isn't quite the situation. But let's get everybody talking and let's see about moving towards this peace conference. And the Brazilians came on board. And there was this meeting in the General Assembly, which, by the way, Wang Yi chaired, and
Yeah,
18
okay.
countries attended. Hungary absolutely wants to be a part. It was under instructions from the European Union and NATO not to attend, but it sent observers. So, incidentally, did France. But
Good.
anyway, Orbán absolutely wants to be a part of that. He supports it. He fully supports it. He's made it clear that he fully supports it. He's pretending that it's his idea, but one shouldn't be too hard on him because he doesn't want people in Europe saying, "Oh well, look, you've adopted a Chinese plan." So he says, "Well, actually, it's not the Chinese plan; it's my plan. I want the peace conference." But everybody is working towards this objective. The Russians have said, if it can be convened in a proper way, yes, of course we will go. The Ukrainians are refusing any negotiations at all. Zelensky came forward a few days ago and he made one of the most astonishing statements I have ever seen, in which he said that what he wants is a diplomatic solution to the war, but one which will be achieved without negotiations. Now, when I read that, I said,
What?
can he really have actually said this? And he did. It's almost exactly the words that there should be a diplomatic and negotiation, diplomatic resolution to the war, but that there should be no negotiations. I mean, it's most bizarre, and the NATO bureaucracies are strongly opposed. Mark Rutte, who's the NATO Secretary General, has just made a speech in which he says war until victory, victory being Ukraine's victory. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, basically wants the same thing. One gets the sense that the Germans, in particular, um, feel that things are not going at all well on the war. The war is being lost. They're trying to find a way out. There's a report circulating that Scholz wants to speak to Putin. I think he'd be better off speaking to Xi Jinping about all this, by the way. But anyway, he wants to talk to Putin and he's trying to find a way out. But the British remain implacably opposed. And I think the Americans don't want it either.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
they absolutely do not want a peace conference of which China is the co sponsor. Following a Chinese proposal to bring peace in Europe, and which might result in what the Russians want and the Chinese say the Russians have a right to, which is a renewed discussion of the overall security system in Europe. So I think this idea isn't going to go anywhere. But that doesn't mean one shouldn't propose it.
Yeah.
Some people in Europe are attracted to it, not just Orban. And if people just don't work to achieve peace, then by definition, peace can't happen. So we might have our doubts that it can work, but I think that, like any responsible foreign minister and diplomat, Wang Yi is right to press forward with it, and so is Orbán, and so are the Brazilians.
So they would just have to, I mean, people who want to see this war end, one peace, they would just need to keep on trying, right? So maybe this time doesn't work, but
Yeah.
after some time, maybe somebody else again to bring this up. Keep on trying, right?
You have to keep on trying, but I'm going to say what my own view is. Firstly, I think that the Ukrainians in July of this year realized that they were going to lose the war. I think the Ukrainians understood this, unless they could find some way to involve the West in the war. I think that in September of this year, last month, the Western powers realized that Ukraine was going to lose the war, and they've had discussions with each other, and I think they've decided that they don't want to intervene directly in the war. But I think that there are powerful forces both in Ukraine and in the West which would rather Ukraine lost than that there be a negotiated peace. Now, that is a terrible thing to say, but I think that is what the position is. From their point of view, a military defeat for Ukraine would be better than a negotiation in which they might feel under pressure to make actual substantive concessions on things like NATO, principles of NATO and EU enlargement, and the security situation in Europe, which they cannot bring themselves to make. And that, I think, from their point of view, as I said, it is a kind of negotiation red line. They would rather a defeat for Ukraine, a situation where there is a permanent armed confrontation in Europe, than a peace in which they have to make concessions.
So in other words, they really want to see Ukrainian to fight until the last Ukraine. They really want to see.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is. I think there are people in Ukraine who want that. I think Zelensky himself seems to want it. I mean, his proposals are becoming increasingly delusional, but I think he wants it. I think there are hardline figures in Ukraine who want it because, from their point of view, they don't want to compromise on their own conception of Ukrainian nationhood. They would prefer preserving the romantic myth of Ukraine. There's a lot of this in Ukraine. Those who don't read Ukrainian statements and things would perhaps have difficulty understanding how irrational a lot of it is, actually. But I think that they would rather go down to complete defeat, like the Germans in the Second World War, than negotiate. And for completely different reasons. I think the hardliners in the United States, in London, in Brussels, would rather see this war go on to the last Ukrainian rather than compromise on things that, from their point of view, are fundamental in preserving the image of the West.
Well, but that will make the situation very dangerous because if that's what Ukraine, basically they themselves decided that they don't want to negotiate, they'll keep on fighting. Well, then they will use every means possible, including eventually, I think they will get the permission to use the long-range missiles to get to inside Russia, which will be Russians' red line. And then we don't know what will happen. I mean, it's getting, to me, that's very dangerous if that's their mentality.
It is incredibly dangerous, but these are incredibly dangerous people. And I've been saying that, for years now, that they have no reverse gear. I mean, I've made that point many times. And just to repeat again, I think it is an incredibly dangerous situation. In chess terms, we are in the end game. The end game is the most difficult. It's going to require incredible self-discipline by the Russians. And this is going to strain the Russians to an extreme degree to try to maintain their discipline in the face of all of the things that are coming, the provocations that are coming. And, in case hopefully I'm right, and there is some chink of a chance that a negotiated outcome can be achieved. It is even more important, given how dangerous the situation is, that people like Wang Yi and Orbán and the others keep on the pressure to try to find a peaceful resolution to this conflict.
Yeah.
I think it is very difficult for people in China, but the mentality, the psychology is completely different, to understand how nihilistic um, attitudes in the West can become. And this isn't new, by the way. I mean, as I said, the Germans were like that at the end of the Second World War. And there are other examples of this in Western history. Unfortunately, we're going through that now, a period of that now.
Yeah, it is very hard for China to understand. Hard for me to
Yeah,
understand.
yeah,
Of course, I
yeah.
would never let it happen in the first place, right? There is the negotiated
No,
Minsk agreements, which seems to me like a pretty
yeah,
fair agreement for both sides, but they totally ignore that and get into this, and there are multiple opportunities for them to put a stop to this, but they still keep on going. It is very hard for me to
no,
understand, for
no.
lots of Chinese to understand, why. It's, what do you get out of it?
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely. It is a point that's been made by many people, including, by the way, by people like Professor Mearsheimer. We're talking about last time we spoke, and Alistair Crook as well. That trying to explain to people who are not part of this Western system how profoundly irrational these people are, and how dangerous that makes them. That is very, very difficult to understand. But we have a habit of this. This is not unique in terms of Western culture and Western thought, that you just keep going, even when you know you're going to lose. You just keep going until you lose. There is this concept in the West, the so-called Viking funeral. The
okay.
Vikings were a warrior nation in the north, where in the end, as in order to have a complete funeral, you burnt down everything around you.
But there is a Chinese saying, there are people who don't cry
Mm.
until they see the coffin, which means they won't believe, that this person, your loved one, already dead, until you see the coffin, until you see the body. So there's a similar idea, is that they won't
Yeah.
believe it until they tried everything, and yeah, until the very end. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that is
Unfortunately.
true, but I think it's quite the. I don't think it is quite the same thing, because
Okay.
what you're talking here is about denial. People
Uh-huh.
who deny deny what is about to happen.
Okay.
Whereas what you can find in the West, and I think we're in that kind of situation now, is that people know that they're going to lose, but they
But they
would
still.
rather lose heroically
Oh,
than as they would say, heroically, rather than compromise. And as I said, that is a very, very dangerous mindset. Remember, heroism is a Greek word. It is completely not the way the Greeks think. Greeks are not like that at all. They would regard that as profoundly stupid and even mad, actually. But there is this outlook in the West, and one has to recognize it.
I would say it's not very heroic at all. I think it's very selfish because they are bringing in innocent
Mm.
people's lives, right? They destroy their own country for what? Because they can't afford to lose face. I mean, I think that's not heroic at all. It's very selfish, I think.
No, it's not. As I said, the word heroic is Greek. It is
Yeah,
absolutely not heroic at all. It is selfish. Is exactly what it is.
yeah.
Egotistical,
Mhm. Coward. I think it's cowardly.
narcissistic.
Yeah,
Well,
narcissistic.
it
Yeah,
it kind of a way it is. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.